something that will bring us reconciliation. Our advantages in numbers will be enough. If in the end it might come into unhappy blows. But he reckoned without thought. The knowledge that the Arkenstone was in their hands of the besiegers burned in their thoughts. Also they guessed the hesitation of Bard and his friends, and resolved to strike while they debated. Suddenly, without a signal, they sprang silently forward to the attack. Bows twangled and arrows whistled. Battle was about to be joined. Still more suddenly, a darkness came on with a dreadful swiftness. A black cloud hurried over the sky. Winter thunder on a wild wind rolled and rolling up, and rumbled in the mountain, and lightning lit in its peak. And beneath the thunder, another blackness could be seen whirling forward. But it did not come with the wind. It came from the north, like a vast cloud of birds, so dense that no light could be seen between their wings. "Halt!" cried Gandalf, who appeared suddenly and stood alone, with arms uplifted between the advantage towards the ranks awaiting them. "Halt!" he called in a voice like thunder, and his soft bass forced like with a flash like the lightning. "Dread has come upon you all. Alas, it has come more swiftly than I guessed. The goblins are upon you, Blog. Blog of the North is coming. O Dane, whose father you slew in Moria, behold, the bats are above his army like a sea of locusts. They ride upon wolves, and wargs are in their train." Amazement and confusion fell upon them, even as Gandalf had been sparkling. The darkness grew. The dwarves halted and gazed at the sky. The elves cried out with many voices. "Come," said cold Gandalf. "There is yet time for counsel. Let Dane's son of Nain come swiftly to us." So began the battle that none had expected, and it was called upon the Battle of Five Armies, and it was very terrible. Upon one side were goblins and wild wolves, and upon the others were elves, men, and dwarves. This is how it fell out. Ever since the fall of the great goblin of the Misty Mountains, the hatred of the race of the dwarves had been rekindled, and furry messengers had passed to and fro between their older cities, colonies, and strongholds, for the resolve now to win the dominion of the north. Tidings they had gathered in secret ways, and in all the mountain there was a forging and an arming. Then they marched and gathered by the hill and valley, going ever by tunnel or under dark, until around and beneath the great mountain Gundabad. And of the north, where was the capital, vast honor host was assembled, ready to sweep down in night time of storm unawares upon the south. Then they learned to the death of Smaug, and joy was in their hearts. And they hastened night after night through the mountains, and came thus at last on a sudden from north, had hard on the heels of Dane. Not even the rabbits knew of their coming until they came out in the broken lands, which divided the lonely mountains from the hills behind. How much Gandalf knew could not be said, but it is plain that he had not expected this sudden assault. This is the plan that he made in council with the Elven king and with Bard, and with Dane, for the dwarf lord now joined them. The goblins were the foes of old, and at their coming at all the quarrels were forgotten. Their only hope was to lure the goblins into batteries and between the arms of the mountain, and themselves to man the great spurs that struck south and east. Yet this would be perilous if the goblins were in sufficient numbers to overrun the mountains itself, and so attack them also from behind and above. But there were no time to make any other plan, or to summon any help. Soon the thunder passed, rolling away to the southeast, but the black cloud came, flying lower over the shoulder of the mountain, and rolled above them, shutting out of the light and filling them with dread. "To the mountain," called Bard. "To the mountain! Let us take our places where there is yet time." On the southern spur in its lower slopes, and the rocks at its feet, the elves were set. On the eastern spur were men and dwarves. But Bard and some of the nimbest of men and elves climbed to the height of the eastern shoulder of a view to the north. Soon they could see the lands before the mountain's feet, black Black was a hurrying multitude. Ere long the vanguard swirled around the spur's end and came rushing into Dale. These were the swiftest wolf riders, and already their cities and halls meant their air affair. A few brave men were strong before they made to make a feint or resistance, and many there fell before the rest drew back and fled to either side. As Gandalf had hoped, the goblin army now enraged into the valley, driving wildly up there between the arms of the mountain, seeking for the foe. Their banners were countless, red, black, red, and they came on like a tide of fury and disorder. It was a terrible battle. They're the most dreadful of all Bilbo's experience, and the ones that which at the time he hated most, which is to say it was the one he had most proud of and most fond of recalling long afterwards. Although he was quite fond of recalling long afterwards, although he was quite unimportant in it. Actually, I may say he put on his ring early in the business and banished from sight, if not from all danger. A magic ring of that sort is not complete protection in the goblin's charge, nor does it stop flying arrows or wild spears, but it does help getting out of the way, and it prevents your head from being specially chosen from the sweeping stroke of the goblin swordsman. The elves were the first to charge. Their hatred for the goblins is cold and bitter. Their spears and swords shone in the gloom, and with a gleam of chill flames, so deadly was the wrath of the hands that held them. As soon as the host of their enemies were dense in the valley, they sent against a shower of arrows, and each flickered as it fled, as if the stinging fire behind the arrows. 1,000 of their spearmen leapt down and charged. The yells were deafening. The rocks were stained black with goblin blood. Just as the goblins were recovering from the onslaught and the elf charge was halted, there arose from across the valley and a deep short roar, with the cries of Moria and Dane, Dane. The dwarves of the Iron Hills plunged in, wielding their mattocks upon the other side, and beside them came the men of the lake with long swords. Panic came upon the goblins, and even as they turned to meet this new attack, the elves charged again and renewed the numbers. Already many of the goblins were flying back down to the river to escape from the trap, and many of their own wolves were turning upon them and rending the dead and the wounded. Victory seemed at hand when a cry rang out on the heights above. Goblins had scaled the mountains from the other side, and already many were on the slopes above the gate, and others were steaming down recklessly, heading of those that fell streaming from the cliff precipice to attack the spurs of the above. Each of this could be reached by paths that ran down from the main mass of the mountain, and in the center and down defenders had too few to bar the way for long. Victory now vanished from hope. They had only steamed the first onslaught of the black tide. They drew on. The goblin gathered again in the valley. There our hosts of wargs came ravaging, and with them came the bodyguard of Bolg, goblins of huge size with skimlets of seals. Soon actual darkness was coming into the stormy sky. While still the great bars swirled up about the heads in the ears of elves and men, or fastened vampire-like on the stricken, now Bard was fighting to defend the eastern spur, and yet giving slowly back, and the elf lords were at bay above the king upon the southern arm, near to the watchpost of Ravenhill. Suddenly there was a great shout, and from the gate came a trumpet call. They forgot about Thorin. Part of the wall, moved by levers, fell out into a crash into the pool. Out lived the king under the mountains, and his companions followed him. Hood and cloak were gone, and shining armor and red light leapt from their eyes, and the groom of the great dwarf gleamed from like gold in the drawing fire. Ropes were hurled down from on high by goblins above, but they held on, leapt down the falls of foot, and rushed forward to battle. Wolf and rider fell or fled before them. Thorn wielded his axe with mighty strokes, and nothing seemed to harm him. To me, elves and men, to me, oh my kinsfolk, he cried, and his voice shook like a horn in the valley. Down, heedless of order, rushed all the dwarves of Dane to his help. Down came many of the lakemen, for Bard could not restrain them. And out upon the other side came could not many of the spearmen of the elves. Once again the goblins were stricken in the valley, and they were piled in heaps till the air was dark and hideous in their corpses. The warriors were scattered, and Thorin drove right against the bodyguard of Borg, but he could not pierce their ranks. Already behind him among the goblin dead lay many men and many dwarves, and many a fair elf that should have linked yet long ages merely in the wood. And as the valley widened, his own scent grew even slower. His number were too few. His flanks were unguarded. Soon the attackers were attacked, and they were forced into a great ring facing everywhere. He hemmed all about the goblins and wolves returning to the assault. The bodyguard of Bolg came howling against them and drove in upon their ranks like waves upon cliffs of sand. Their friends could not help them, for force upon either side, men and elves were slowly beaten down. On all these this Bilbo looked miserably, and he had taken his stand on Ravenhill among the elves, partly because there was more chance of escape from that point, and partly was the more tookish part of his mind, because if he was going to be in the last desperate stand, he preferred on the whole to defend Elven King Gandalf too. I may say it was there sitting on the ground, if there is deep thought, preparing, I suppose, some last blast of magic before the end. That did not seem far off. If it will not be long now, thought Bilbo, before the goblins win the gate, and we are all slaughtered or driven down and captured. Really, it is enough to make one weep. After all one has gone through, I would rather old Smaug would be left with all the wretched treasure, and than these wild creatures should get in. And poor old Bomber, Balin, Fili, and Killy, and all the rest came to the bad end, and Vard too, and the Lakeman and the merry elves. Misery me, I have heard of songs of many battles, and I have always understood to defeat many may be glorious. It seems very uncomfortable, not to say distressing it. I wish I was well out of it. The clouds were torn by wind, and a red sunset looked round. He gave a great cry. He had seen a sight that made his heart leap. Dark shapes, yes, small yet majestic against the distant glow. The eagles! The eagles! He shouted. The eagles are coming! Bilbo's eyes were seldom wrong. The eagles were coming down the wind, line after line, in such a host as must have gathered from all the eyries of the north. The eagles are the eagles! The eagles! Bilbo cried, dancing and waving his arms. If the elves could not see him, they could hear him. Soon they took up the cry, and it echoed across the valley. Many wondering eyes looked up, and though as yet nothing could be seen except from the thousand shoulders of the mountain, the eagles, cried Bilbo once more. But at the moment a stone hurling from above smote heavily on his helm, and he fell with a crash and knew no more.